Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? I assisted with a post-mortem when I was a student. Female patient died in her 40s. Her medical history had extensive complaints of abdominal pains. One doctor even referred to her as a hypochondriac and others commented on apparent anxiety. Opened her abdomen, and she had extensive scar tissue. She was absolutely marked inside from endometriosis. She suffered for decades and never got referred for a laparoscopy. She didn't have ducking anxiety, she had a medical condition. Edit, a few clarifications. Patient cause of death was unrelated. I won't give any details because it may get too identifying. I'm UK based and this was an NHS post-mortem. Patient did not have diagnosed anxiety. Doctors referred to her anxiety only in relation to her abdominal pain complaints, no other known history. Thank you for sharing your stories with me and others. I will take the time to read every one. I really hope someone sent that autopsy report to the doctor that labeled her a hypochondriac. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon/medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night. To many people during the day, one time it was really late. Around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move/twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. The professor did some digging literally. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit. Morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started on urology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tankmates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our lab that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. I have more stories, if anyone is curious. Edit, I should add that her granddaughter made a point of saying this lady did not hold a grudge on her brother, and they lived full lives on happy terms. My old martial art instructor was a policeman in the 80s. He was shot with birdshot in his torso and many of the pellets were not removed. He said that sometimes they make their way to the surface and he can just scratch them out. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they are made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh." Right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There is nothing wrong with them. They are tired and just can't sleep. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy in Cadast. One of the lectures was to observe forehead trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden the person was a crime scene and they had to call the police again and leave the person as into shade as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. Edit. This blew up. Thanks for all the upvotes. As someone pointed out, there must have been some information that was missed between the police and coroner. I myself was not present, but I do believe the story is true, as it is now a lecture in why you should always examine for skull trauma and not just storm something before knowing. Also edit. There seemed to be a lot of interest, so I have added another story which is unfortunately true, but crazy. How do you miss a gunshot wound to the head? Edit. And if the person did commit suicide by gun, then the gun would be with the body, right? Like a dead person with a gun in their hand isn't a clue at all? Second edit. Obviously the question is rhetorical. Stop asking me if I'm blind to the poor quality of police. Masters in forensic pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though. Saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Or the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. It's so wild to me how on the one side, humans can be so resilient and survive horrible things, and on the other side just how fragile and quick life can be taken from us. 2 very different extremes. Thanks for sharing your perspective. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip up do happen from time to time. Holy cheese. I get freaked out when my cat finds a stray rubber band, like produce rubber band, and pukes up the chewed up remnants. I can't imagine any creature eating metal wire. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy cheese, but the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain, and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20 plus years ago, however he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show, cause the family was well known in my area. We found your son that went missing 2 decades ago, also your wife cheated and I are with your brother Havigadone. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless, based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off, To place a catheter we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The penis was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. Edit. I remembered another one. In my final year of training we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques, e.g. difficult intubation, cricothyroidotomy, etc. Close bracket. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't par. I think she has some kind of growth or mar in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It of course had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of death identified. Oh god. This one is terrible. Poor guy. That must have been excruciating. My wife is a pathologist assistant, and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child, and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point, now has no interest. Oh, that is absolutely horrible. The poor woman. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggle to breathe but antibiotics, steroids and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away, and I cut her open to see what the hell happened fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with chews. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life, and it didn't kill her until she was 2. Poor baby. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied, and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ear and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s, and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his A. How did the shotgun blast not show any outward signs? One would imagine at least some kind of visible wound from that. That guy must have clenched his cheeks hard. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, x-ray, or CORT, of the upper chest / abdomen / pelvis. No bullet. At that point someone said duck it, let's scan the whole body. Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa area behind the knee. It had embolized / traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. How the duck does a bullet even fit inside a blood vessel? Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs, dissected everything, completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as a last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I'm single and happy being single, and honestly I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food, dying alone in my apartment, my cat eating my face. In college I took a figure drawing class and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it, so he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions. Of course, have you ever found something weird in a body came up? The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him in particular / not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds, and so nobody recognized who he was, unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life, and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it aside from that he was particular endowed, and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit and the teacher said sure, dissect his penis / see why it's hard still, and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the penis itself goes into shade from their dissections, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30 to 40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. I iced head in a surgery years back to remove a rod just like that. It's apparently an old dead treatment, and you see it a lot in older patients with chronic heart issues or diabetes. To my knowledge they don't do it much anymore, and replaced it with a newer tech. The surgery was to remove the rod and replace it with a sort of saline pump system. There was a reservoir placed in the groin, a pump was placed in the scrotum, and there were 2 tubes with one along either side of the penis, more towards the underside. When it was go time, dude would just pump it up like a pair of Voldrier box, and when he was done there was a valve button on the pump in his scrotum he could use to release the saline back into the reservoir. On a side note, I had completely blocked this memory until just now. Not sure if I'm glad to know the answer or not yet. I heard a story once about a guy who died, and completely unrelated to the main complaint, during the autopsy they found a grapefruit in his ear. Apparently it had just been there the whole time. I've heard of a navel orange, but never an anal grapefruit. I did the autopsy of both a robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their 4th lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Does a sectioned aorta mean instant death? I'm a pre-med student, and one time, while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile vs pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and they cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered and bone fragments pulled back with the skin, and when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged and the eyeballs had been pushed back / fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. What did you do with the $9,000 in cash? I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out, and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth, and it was full of blueberry muffin mix, and it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to par out while eating the muffin mix, and he ended up choking to death. I initially misread this as you put your finger into your own mouth to verify that it was blueberry muffin mix, and I gagged. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus. Found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec, easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. My theory is she was gonna start carrying drugs that way, but wanted to practice with something that wouldn't kill her first. Forensic pathologist here. To come to mind. I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back I pulled the sheet back and already knew he looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted quizzed by PD about are you sure? Because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact, fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. Seeing a cadaver that looks like an older you sounds like a Twilight Zone premise. I used to ace with wildlife necropsies for the state F&W department. To come to mind. Someone shot an otherwise healthy looking deer and brought it in because they found something weird when they cut it open to gut it. Sure enough, there was a cantaloupe-sized sphere of tissue in its belly. It had thick, very smooth, slightly rubbery walls. The vet was pretty sure it was an abscess, but said it was the largest wild-off one she'd ever seen whole like this. Cut it open, and, sure enough, the walls were about a 1/4 inch thick, and then it was just all pus. A meat cantaloupe filled with pudding thick pus. Also, we got a dead bat in, a little brown bat, they're tiny, and inside it was a dead also, fully formed bat fetus, near term but without fur. It was almost a third of the size of the mom. Super cool. Edit, I found a picture of the pus cantaloupe. Enter at your own risk NSFL. Imgur, I don't consent for this material to be shared outside of Reddit without my permission. E.g. on other clickbait websites /list aggregator /YouTube. A meat cantaloupe filled with pudding thick pus is a sentence. My high school science teacher was a coroner, or whatever, and one day was asked to perform an autopsy on a little girl who was shot by a shotgun. He quit on the spot. He was an absolutely fantastic teacher. Someone close to me worked in refrigeration and was called to go to a working morgue room where bodies were on racks, not in wall units where the fridge unit was loud, and was told the bodies would all be covered. He went there and most were not covered and many had stained sheets on them. He mustered up enough guts to get to the buzzing refrigerator unit on the ceiling. He then noticed a small wheeled table with uncovered parts on it. It ended up being a baby cut into pieces. He noped the F out after that. Late to the thread so this will probably get buried. Disclaimer, I'm a doctor, but not an autopsy doctor, and had never really considered pathology as a specialty when I was in medical school. This event happened in anatomy lab when I was in medical school. In the preclinical years of medical school, most medical schools have students enroll in anatomy lab where we dissect cadavers as part of the course. One of the anatomy labs had a cadaver who had passed away from complications from kidney failure, according to the identification tab. While that anatomy team was dissecting some of the leg and buttock muscles, they found a bullet in the gluteus medius. No idea how it got there and totally unrelated to the cause of death. I like to imagine the guy signing paperwork to donate his body to science, thinking that the med students dissecting his butt would get a funny surprise. He might not have known you'd dissect his butt lol. I didn't realize they do that, and I'm donating my body when I die. I just thought it was the head /chest/ and reproductive organs. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in, but we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. Jesus Christ, what are the odds? Where was the hole in relation to the vocal cords though? Were you not able to visualize them? My grandmother had a mild stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side and died in her 60s from a heart attack, but while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer, but she never had any pain from it because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker, so it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. Lung cancer is usually asymptomatic until late stage, so this scenario isn't as unusual as you might think. Getting chest pain or cough usually only occurs at stage 3 onwards. Stage 1 or 2 typically found incidentally, i.e. if they are being investigated for other things and you see something on a scan. Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died, and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated etc. to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Edit. Unfortunately, this is all the information I know on this story. It's been 7 years since I worked at that place. This reminds me of a guy in Florida that was picking up dead iguanas. It had gotten so cold they would fall out of the trees dead. Except they weren't dead and sprung back to life as they warmed up in his car. He crashed but was fine. Medical examiner here. This probably isn't a big wow revelation, but it certainly made an impact on me. Very early in my career, I did an exam on another doctor who worked at the hospital where I trained. I didn't know this gentleman personally, but was acquainted with him by reputation. He was a very happy-go-lucky sort, much loved by everyone in his department. He died unexpectedly at a young age of what turned out to be a drug overdose on pharmaceuticals he had been diverting from the hospital. I don't think anybody saw that coming, myself included. It was a lesson to me that anybody can fall victim to addiction, and that it's hard to know what anybody's private struggles are. When I worked in the federal government as a physician assistant, we had a pharmacist in his 30s die in the federal prison we both worked at. He was substituting non-narcotic medication patches for fentanyl patches because he'd gotten addicted. They found him dead in the pharmacy. He had 6 patches on his body at the time, and the option was they stopped his heart and lungs, a dangerous side effect of opioids. Inmates prescribed the pain meds had been complaining they weren't working, but no one believes inmates in prison. They pretty much lie all the time. It is just part of the way prison is. Inmates can't be seen as friendly or cooperating with staff, and staff can't be seen as friendly to inmates. So the complaints were ignored. Everyone was surprised when it turned out they were telling the truth. Not an autopsy doctor, but did take anatomy and physiology second with lab in college. The lab was working on cadavers being prosected by more advanced students. A prosection is the dissection of a cadaver, human or animal, or part of a cadaver by an experienced anatomist in order to demonstrate for students anatomic structure. Anyway, one of the cadavers, we had a male and a female for obvious reasons, was a big ol' Linebacker looking dude. And older bodybuilder type. His age at time of death was late 50s. His heart has been removed by the anatomist, and we were examining it because it was very enlarged and contributed to his death. We all had to hold it in our hands to feel the heft, like size and weight, and compare it to the heft of the female's heart, which was normal sized, about like a large apple. The male's heart, for comparison, was the size of a small cantaloupe. I went first, for whatever reason, and the instructor lifted the enlarged heart out of its preservative bath and placed it in my hands. I damn near dropped the thing when it shocked me with what felt like a jolt of electricity. I, understandably, I think, made a startled noise, and the instructor took the heart back before I could juggle it onto the floor. "Oh," he said. "I forgot to warn you, look out for the pacemaker." Apparently when someone has a pacemaker there's a battery too, and they don't bother taking it out/off. They just snip the leads and leave it there, so if you touch both bare leads you get a mild shock, even through your exam gloves. That was a mildly disturbing experience. Haha, I laughed at your story. What kind of gloves was the instructor wearing? Were they just used to the shock? I'm a med student, not a pathologist or coroner. But in anatomy lab the tank next to me had a donor with an inflatable penis pump inside his scrotum and shaft. It was completely self-contained. Fluid in the container in the scrotum could be pumped into the shaft tube creating an erection. Then the fluid would just be released back into the pump and the boner would go away. Pretty wild. So the guy had to press his balls to get an erection? I'm a former police officer and attended several autopsies to record info for investigation files. One guy had been shot and killed, so the cause of death was pretty clean, but the pathologists doing the autopsy found a tumor the size of a walnut on his brainstem. He said the guy would have been dead in a few months, even if he hadn't been shot. Another guy was dead due to a steak knife being stabbed through his heart by his wife. She claimed she grabbed the knife because she was scared he was going to kill her, and when he lunged at her the knife just went in. But when the doctor pointed out a half dozen or so marks that looked like freckles around the wound, he swabbed to develop a solution that clearly showed they were tiny little poke marks. I was able then to get her to confess that he was goading her. Go ahead, do it until she hauled off and kabobbed him. It's not always like TV shows where the autopsy is the aha moment that solves a case, but sometimes it really is. I was able then to get her to confess that he was goading her. Go ahead, do it until she hauled off and kabobbed him. What are you gonna do? Stab me? Not a doctor, but recently I was reading about Hiroshima/Nagasaki and one person's perspective. When their family member who experienced the disaster died many years later, they were cremated, and left in their ashes were tiny pieces of broken glass and metal from the initial explosions. Edit. Article here. It requires a subscription, but you should be able to read it, because I put a after com, like com. Thanks you / butter surprise. My auntie is a coroner, and she was told to expect nothing more than a gunshot wound to a pregnant female. Which is what it was, but the bullet had killed the woman, a 9-month developed baby who had the bullet pass through and end up in the palm of its hand like it was holding it. I hate this story. I was a forensic tech for a state medical examiner's office for about 2 years. I've eyes-ted in about 1,000 autopsies and have removed bodies from scenes from likely twice that. I told these stories in another AskReddit thread about people who clean up crime scenes, and I have a few takeaways. 1. Man who had a psychotic break and castrated himself and stuffed it all into this mouth before cutting his own throat. 2. Man who was sodomized to death with a broom, a baseball bat, and the tuning end of a guitar. 3. Man who decapitated himself by hanging himself with high tension cable and jumping off a bridge. 4. Woman overdosing whilst carrying an 8-month pregnancy. No really any major revelations like, in terms of something wild unexpected, or a medical finding that contradicts the police report. Just seen enough cheers in one lifetime for 100 people. Edit. You can likely dig through my posts if you want to find the whole stories. Pretty sure my profile is public. Your activity on r/cooking made that a bit of a wild ride to scroll through. Recipe for chicken breast story about a guy castrating himself. Tarragon Harlan days. You do have some interesting stories in there though, for sure. Totally not related but somewhat related. My sister-in-law works in medicine, and one of her cleas involved studying and dissecting cadavers. One day in class they wheeled in a body, and when they pulled back the sheet, a girl fainted when she realized it was her aunt. I'll keep this out of the main thread with the other unrelated stuff. Have a friend that was vegetarian because she had to attend dissections for pharmacy. Apparently slicing human muscle was too much like roast beef for her. I'm not a pathologist, but I work in a field adjacent to it. One patient was heart attack caused by cocaine use. The heart was apparently giant, like having to use cocaine just to keep the heart going. My dad used to be a pathologist assistant and had to quit after a teenage suicide around the age of my brother, then a couple or 3 SIDS cases, which is sudden infant death syndrome, in the same week. I visited a dissection lab at a nearby university when I was in high school, and one guy was laid out on the table in front. We asked how he died, and the professor pointed at a jar and said that's how, and it was the guy's heart. It was bigger than his head. I'm a medical student, not a doctor, but when I dissected my cadaver in my first year, it had lots of surgical markings and was pretty overweight. After I'd been able to work through all the parts of the body with my group, we were able to piece together with our lab leader that our donor had been in and out of the hospital for a quadruple bypass, followed by a basilica, a stomach stapling, and then what looked like an emergency open heart surgery that she died during. Not a rare disease or strange occurrence per se, but it was interesting finding clues around the body as we learned anatomy. You could tell in what order those occurred. Medical student here, and this story is from anatomy class. One of the cadavers in our class died of cancer, and when we took out the gentleman's liver it was very large and full of bumps all over. The liver itself was also hard as a rock. The poor man's cancer had spread all over his liver and was full of tumors. It really hit home that this was what cancer was like and demonstrated its pure destructive nature. We have a man's liver in a pot at my uni, and it is rather large, but more importantly it looks Dalmatian spotted with metastatic melanoma. After that class I immediately made an appointment for that afternoon to organize a biopsy on what turned out to be one on my arm. The word you are looking for is coroner or medical examiner, or forensic pathologist, which is a doctor who works in a hospital. In fact most autopsies, at least around here, are done by doctors in hospitals, not the state medical examiners. State medical examiner only does suspicious deaths. Not a doctor, but I did a necropsy on one of my birds a couple weeks ago. I couldn't tell how she died before it happened, but after opening her up I found about 14 ms of tissue in her reproductive system. At first I thought it was cancer from dissecting one of the ms. Later I found out it was actually an intestinal infection. Edit. It was actually a reproductive tract infection. Some of y'all were asking about the vulture that lives in my backyard, named Randy, so I made r/Randith the vulture. I had to do one on one of my birds the other day too. She had a mara fluid the size of a closed fist inside her, 150 g of fluid weight. It was pushing everything inside to the outside, and we never even saw that coming. Cystic oviduct. I'm sorry about your bird. Open bracket. Not a forensic pathologist or me, but I occasionally liaised with an office as part of local print media in the aughties. Many fascinating stories, but the one that stuck with me, no pun intended, was from an me who discovered, while dissecting a man's heart, that he had killed himself by first heating peanut butter to a liquid and then injecting it. It reached his heart and clogged it up, and that's an image my brain still loves to dwell on now and then. RIP releases in pieces. I'm not a doctor, but my dad was a police officer, and once a reporter came to the lab and my father was escorting her. She watched a full autopsy, but when my father started eating his sandwich it gave a loud crack and poor lady thought that the body made the sound and threw up in the middle of the autopsy. Reporter: I can't tell if that was a mistake or some sort of play on words. As someone who is waiting on autopsy results from the coroner on a loved one, I find this incredibly fascinating and frightening at the same time. Sorry for your loss. I hope the autopsy brings some clarity and closure for you. My dad did autopsies as a night job while he went to college during the day. He said the hardest ones were the children. He did an autopsy on a 6-month-old whose mother suffered from postpartum, and she told the cops that voices were telling her to put her son in the bathtub. She ran near boiling water and held him under. He said when he got to the hospital chunks of skin were falling off and the organs were liquid on the table. The other one he talks about are the people who are subjects of murder and they are buried. The decomposition process needs oxygen to break down cells, and when they are buried it takes a lot long for them to decompose. When cops find bodies they unearth them, and it takes a matter of hours for the bodies to decompose drastically. The smell of one particular individual that was murdered and buried in a cornfield for 6 weeks could be smelled from 3 floors above the operating room, and was so bad that it was making patients and nurses sick. Not me, but I read a story of a guy that drank antifreeze because he was freezing to death, and it actually worked for a bit before he died a terrible death from the antifreeze. On the plus side, he showed up to the morgue already embalmed. Med student almost graduated here. A couple years ago I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4/5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the air, probably due to heart failure. The body had mild ascites, fluid in the abdomen, so at first he had to evacuate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen and the yellow rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease and the liver and the kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighted more than 10 kilograms, normal weight 2-3 kilograms, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally 150 g each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts. In order to get samples, they popped like airballs, spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard, but I think I will remember forever this one, in particular that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. PS. I'm sorry for any mistakes, but I'm not a native English speaker. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts. In order to get samples, they popped like airballs, spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. I'm sorry, but this is hilarious. Newly graduated doctor here. Maybe not a medical revelation per se, but a revelation to me when I was a student watching my first autopsies. Female, late 50s, very obese. Typical case, you might say. She died at home alone. Incision through very thick layers of fat. Then, every inch of her viscera was covered in fat. Slick, slippery, yellow. The sound is obscene. Her sternum and ribs are snapped open to review the chest. The medical examiner tells us the correct way to remove the organs is such that everything can be dangled from the tongue. My colleague leaves the room. Her heart weight tripled than that of the normal 70-something man lying next to her. What is supposed to be red muscle is just sickly yellow fat. When you touched it, the coronary arteries were rock hard. The lungs are next. Heavy, again. Sliced into pieces by knife, and liquid starts oozing out of it. Squeeze it, air bubbles and more liquid oozes out from tiny alveoli spaces. Plague heart failure, pulmonary edema, explains the swollen ankles. Some pus comes out too. Maybe she had a pneumonia. Liver isn't much better, although at this point yeah, I'd be more surprised if she didn't have fatty liver disease. Kidneys scarred from years of hypertension. Getting the brain out is the hardest to watch. A cut is made in the occipital scalp and the top of the head flipped onto the face. Saw opens the skull. Brain gets weighed like the rest. What it holds in her final moments we'll never know. It gets set aside with the other organs. When done, all the viscera is put into a plastic bag. This is put back into her open abdomen, now empty. They sew it all back up with thick sutures you won't use in the living. The scalp is put back together. The skin is cleaned. The doctor leaves us with this gem as she hung up her gown. If only you could diagnose people like this in hospital and in surgery, your job would be much easier. For those interested in what an obese body looks like, here is an excellent documentary from the BBC, NSFW warning. Not for the faint-hearted. Yao, please take care of your body and stay healthy. Edit. Living people, not real people. Whoops. I was writing this just before crashing, so excuse my mistake. Didn't think it was possible that a few paragraphs could motivate me to exercise this much. A suspect had been arrested for murder. During the autopsy it was determined the decedent had been shot post-mortem, several hours post-mortem. The decedent's cause of death was me, so the suspect was charged with abuse of a corpse. It makes you wonder what goes through people's minds. What's in me? I'm just going to save this one for later and hope it blows up. Yeah, I want real answers. I shared the closest I've got, just to hopefully keep it alive enough to get better answers. Unfortunately, I suspect coroners are not allowed to discuss autopsies. There was this girl my mum grew up with on an army base. She had a really long plait she used to chew on in her sleep, and she choked to death on a hairball once. Apparently it was the size of a kiwi fruit lodged in her throat. She choked to death on a hairball once is usually all it takes. I was in charge of making copies of all evidence to be used in the trial of Donald Harvey in 1989. He was known as the Angel of Death. One bit of evidence was an autopsy photo of an exhumed elderly woman. The examiner was holding with tweezers an 18-piece of cotton being pulled from her throat. Harvey liked to stuff cotton so far down into the victims' throats that it could not be seen. I still can't shake the image from my brain. God, that's fucking horrible. My mom loves this story. My aunt got accepted into nursing school, but had to get prerequisites done in the summer. She knew someone who pulled some strings, and she was put into a pre-med club that taught pretty much the same thing as one of her nursing classes. She was the only woman, and because she has always looked younger than she is, and she was only 20 to begin with, and she's really pretty, all the pre-med students groaned and complained that she would keep hold the club back. Anyway, time came for the cadaver lab. The decedent had been in a car accident. The lab director and professor kept telling them that they weren't looking for a cause of death, it had already been determined that they were just looking at the anatomy. My aunt was looking over the x-rays and asked what were the circumstances of the accident. My grandpa was a firefighter/paramedic, so she knew that was a huge thing. The professor is like, we're not looking for the cause of death. We told you it was trauma from a car accident. My aunt responds, there's a small spot on his kidney right here on the x-ray. They went and checked the kidney, and sure enough, there was a tiny tumor in his kidney. Based on the size and placement, it was determined that the tumor would have caused excruciating pain similar to a kidney stone. Based on that information and the nature of the car accident, they said the man either blacked out from the pain while driving, or had a sharp sudden pain that caused him to lose control of the vehicle. They had to change the death certificate to add that to the contributory causes. And my aunt also set the curve for the clap. And, 2 years later, she parred the boards with the top score. While in labor, my cousin was literally born 3 to 4 hours after my aunt pretty much aced the boards. My mom just informed me she merely parred the boards. My mistake. I'm glad the pre-med students didn't hold her back. What a brilliant woman. Situation of someone I know. They were working late on a weekday night with few staff in the building. They were in the hallway when all of a sudden he felt a hand on his shoulder which totally scared the hell out of him. The hand was from a guy with a tag on him who was recently pronounced dead. Guy either came back from dead or had a very light pulse at time of declaration. Can't remember which. They would just have to swap the tag from him to me because I would die on the spot. Oh my god, this just reminded me I'm a vet student and we have a pathology lab where we do autopsies on dead animals, most of them submitted by local farms to see if there's something that may be contagious, or to see if the death was a result of the way of living. Some owners wanting to know what happened to their pets, etc. At first it's kind of disturbing, but after a few autopsies you get used to it. So anyway, during lab one of the technicians brings in a big box, and you can hear chirps from the inside. Our professor was still focused on the first autopsy of a dog, but I managed to slip a bit closer to the box. Little chicks. They were adorable, so I stuck around to observe them. The technician then moves them all into a plastic container and asks me to hold the lid. I figured it was to prevent the babies from jumping out, so I gladly helped. However, before I can even process what's going on, she tells me to pop open the lid just enough for her to slide a hose in, and I automatically do so. She then tells me not to flinch. I saw that the hose was connected to a big red cylinder, but didn't put 2 and 2 together until it was too late. Next thing I know, the loud PRSSSSSST sound comes, and there's cold white mist coming from the container, the loud chirps getting fainter. The chicks were sent in by a farmer's specimens because there was a disease or something that contaminated the whole farm. They needed to perform an autopsy on them. The technician had to find an efficient way to preserve the specimens. She froze them to death with a fire extinguisher. I then knew what it was like to be an accessory to murder. I firmly believe I will never, for as long as I live, forget the dread of hearing chirps getting fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. If you really love animals, don't go to vet school. Edit, you really went and made my most traumatic experience in aiding to the murder of little chicks my most upvoted comment. Huh. My dad used to work for a research lab back in the 70s as a odd job man, and they used chicks for some sort of testing they did. One day he came into work and got told to dispose of 30 perfectly healthy chicks as they no longer needed them. They meant for him to put them in an incinerator. Anyway, this is how my parents ended up with 30 chooks and dad had a change in careers. I miss him so much. He was the best dad ever. Deleted. We have a case in my region that was ruled natural causes, even though the body was found divided between 2 separate sleeping bags. I'm not a doctor, but my uncle, dad's only brother, died when he was 17 in a car accident. In 1975, they did an autopsy and told my grandparents he died on impact and didn't suffer. My dad personally knew the autopsy doctor and he told him that he didn't die on impact. He suffered for a bit and had internal bleeding, and that's what ultimately caused his death. My dad hasn't and will never tell his parents. My neighbor's youngest brother died when he was 4 years old. It was the 1950s, and I suppose standard procedure was different back then. The boy possibly had an asthma attack and fell unconscious. The entire neighborhood rushed to ACE. They were all friends, and besides this, he was a popular little guy, and they concluded that he was dead. However, one of the neighbors held a mirror under his nose and announced, "He's alive. There's breath on the mirror." Everyone else said that there wasn't. My neighbor's mother went to her grave decades later believing that her child had been buried alive. In most circumstances, I agree that putting the parent's mind to rest somewhat is the best decision. I'm not a pathologist, but when my father died from drowning, it was noted he had acute cirrhosis of the liver. The coroner also removed a bullet from between his heart and spine that dad received in Vietnam. It was very degraded. He had also lost a thumb and several feet of intestine there, the evidence of which was noted in the report. Dad had served 22 years in the army and had been awarded the Purple Heart 3 times. He lived a hard life after, and it was speculated he would have passed soon of cirrhosis of the liver had he not drowned. 9 cream eggs. I like how you didn't elaborate, but we all know what you mean. Disclaimer, not a pathologist. In anatomy lab in medical school, we found one of the cadavers had a penis pump. There's a pump you squeeze in the scrotum that pushes water, stored up in a hard plastic water balloon in the abdominal cavity, into a tube in the penis. Other story I've told before, but I was dissecting the back of a knee when the knee implant that I didn't know was there popped out. For a brief stupid moment I thought it was a Terminator and screeched, "You/screw England Clamets by any chance?" Former homicide detective here. Suspicious death. 30-ish male found alone by cleaning staff in the back row of a sparsely attended sci-fi movie. Strange scratching wounds around/in mouth. Some petechiae in eyes and on cheeks, but no signs of strangulation. No obvious signs of chronic illness or disease. Presented as healthy normal adult male. Found on his person was a wallet with normal contents and a single cancelled movie ticket, indicating he went alone. Weird spy movie chiz going on here. Autopsy, a large amount of popcorn compacted in his esophagus. Like a half cup. Dude was apparently excited by the movie, stuffing popcorn in his mouth, and choked. The scratch marks around/in his mouth were self-inflicted, trying to dig out popcorn. Verified via fingernail scrapings. His was only DNA present. Loud movie. He was in the back. No one saw or heard him choke. I've never eaten popcorn again. Bad accident during high school, missing scalp of young girl, coroner couldn't find it. My buddy worked at impound yard and found it embedded in broken windshield frame/slab. Pretty gruesome. Late to the party, but in university I applied and got into the prosection lab. Basically, we got the fresh pickled cadaver and dissected it for the anatomy lab. We weren't told anything about his medical history or cause of death. List of things we found: metal fragments in his quad and calf sternum was wired together, old surgery, blood jelly in the brain, old school stent above the heart. There were other weird things. Mostly though I still struggle with the smell of pepperoni because it's so similar to embalmed corpse. Found that out after prosecuting for a few hours and then going to the cafeteria for pepperoni pizza and then vomiting said pepperoni pizza. As a student in the medical field, I had the opportunity to visit a cadaver lab. I was very surprised to see how many people had died from choking. Out of the 12 or so cadavers in the lab that day, at least 7 or 8 were from choking. I went home and immediately looked up how to perform self-immolation. Not a doctor, but in a dissection of an extremely emaciated cat in biology lab we found a small piece of cellophane blocking her ileum, the flap in the stomach, that leads to the large intestines. The poor kitty had been able to eat, but starved to death, because her body was unable to extract nutrients from the food. When I was in high school I was nominated to represent the school called the Youth Leadership Program that was organized by my hometown's Chamber of Commerce. Each day of the week we had a day off from school and joined these little themed field trips and basically serving our town's communities. One day was Agriculture Day, next was Arts and Humanities Day, etc. One of these days, I will never forget, was Criminal Justice Day. We went to the police department. We met the chief of police, listened to his lecture, and showed us around the offices and even the jail cells. We didn't see the prisoners in their cells, because of numerous reasons of it being unsafe, and violating the privacy of these inmates. After that we took a bus to the coroner's office. Dude, this moment was such an impact, and still gives me the chills till this day. I just thought they were going to be like the usual lecture, the end. Nope, they showed us slides of numerous amounts of cases of murder / suicide / unnatural deaths / natural deaths. Actual slides of aerial dead human beings. Totally gut-wrenching and mind-scarring pictures of mutilated bodies or emotional impacting scenes of the person's scene / body presentation of death. Made me physically and emotionally sick. That wasn't the end yet. Oh no, we had a too long story short. We saw an actual live autopsy done to an adult man in their 20s 30s. Cause of death was overdose. I don't remember from what, but my guess may be cocaine or meth, because they were showing off at how his heart was 2x bigger than a normal human heart. Correct me if I'm wrong. Chest cavity was exposed. They pulled out his tongue. I have no idea why. And lastly saw through his skull to grab his brain. Coroners came by the window we were staring out from and showed off the man's brain. The smell was horrendous. Still can remember the smell. I think about that day every single day after that, and how wrong it was. Imagine being the parent of that man. I know that he's gone, but that was once a human being, and we were all there staring at his mutilated body that was once his. You need to talk to your hometown's Chamber of Commerce, because there's no way you go from arts and crafts to straight mutilated dead bodies. I was an investigator for a state medical examiner for just over 2 years. Had a mom that had drank herself to death according to the husband, after relapsing on Mother's Day weekend. I just felt like something was off. Sent her for an autopsy. Had a ruptured liver, where dude had essentially beat her till she internally bled to death. Later, while out on bail, he stole a semi-truck, crashed it in a pond, got out shooting at a deputy, and they killed him. Saved the taxpayers a good chunk of money. Not me, but my biology teacher said at uni they had a cadaver which died from drunk driving, and when they opened his skull it smelled of the alcohol. I have a feeling your teacher lied to you in an effort to caution his students about alcohol. Med schools generally don't accept cadavers that have severe burning or trauma. If you're in an accident that's bad enough to take your life, your body is going to sustain a significant amount of trauma and would be in no condition to be donated. Edit, Mr. Word. Apparently there are some hidden notes on the autopsy of a well-known politician who was urinated in Dallas. In the middle of the autopsy they found some beads in his large colon, which was expected. The unexpected part was that they spelled out in Morse code. This is why you use the serious tag. Drink more Ovaltine. Working in the young man comes in, one of 4 in a nasty auto accident. Speed plus INEXPERIENC equals CAR flipped. Pinjas ejected. One expired shortly after coming into the I transported the body down to the morgue. First time I had felt a human being with all their bones broken. Felt like trying to lift sheets full of rolling bowling balls. Once in the morgue I commented how unscathed he looked. He really did. Some dirt, the tube, not much else. Me offered I could view the autopsy if interested. I was interested. The first thing they noted were the rays of the fractures. Basically all the major bones including multiple rib fractures. When they opened the body the organs were described as near liquefied. It wasn't until weeks later I got the whole story from the EMT who had been on scene. Seems the passenger had been one half and one half out the window while the car had been flipping. He was just days shy of 17. The driver was just days past 16. His parents had bought him a brand new car. He'd had it less than 72 hours. Driver lived, though with severe brain damage. Front and rear passengers died. Rear driver's side passenger survived with not too much permanent physical damage. I have friends whose kids are getting their driver's license. I never par up a chance to drop that story on them. I've seen a lot of FD up things in my healthcare career. That is one of the grand total of 3 that make me tear up, and it's one from early on. Med student here. Had a guy out on cocaine which he frequently used. Was an alcoholic for 30+ years, and had a history of seizures. Evidently he had been hit in the head with a baseball as a young adult, and never saw a document. I went to take his brain out, and this dude had a walnut-sized hole in his skull. And the brain underneath looked like someone had taken an ice cream scoop to it. He had been walking around 30+ years with this hole in his head, and having seizures BC of it. No wonder he started drinking. His liver was absolutely normal though. My high school biology teacher had originally trained as some sort of medical professional in India. He used to tell a story about doing a dissection prac. Apparently the college started the process with some kind of ceremony where the students paid respect to the body they were going to dissect by placing a small offering of some sort with each cadaver. In his class, one of the lab techs decided to mess with the students, and after making up just enough offerings for the number of cadavers, then set up an extra table in the fast end of the room, and laid himself out on it. The students came in, placed the offerings, missing the far table with the lab tech. As they were leaving, the tech suddenly sat up and demanded, "Where's my offering?" Cop here. Interesting story. Guy goes head on into a concrete underpass at 100 miles per hour. Dead on impact. Mild damage to body, car, etc. Coroner says probably suicide, possible medical condition, but damage is too severe to determine exact cause. Either way, blunt force trauma is ruled. A decade goes by, this is not on anyone's mind whatsoever. Guy gets arrested for an unrelated homicide. Confesses to that murder and a few others. One of which is the crash. Apparently, argument with drugs ensued between the two and bad guy shoots other in the head. To cover his tracks he pins the accelerator in victim car at night and launches it down road. Second autopsy is performed on the body and sure enough, bullet was in the skull. Put a serious tag on this. Always put a serious tag on everything. Here's my personal favorite from forensics class. A suicidal guy rode a bicycle for about 50 miles to get to the middle of nowhere. There, he climbed a radio tower, bringing his bicycle along to the top, drank a lethal dose of poison, mercuric cyanide if memory serves, then shot himself with 2 handguns simultaneously, one to the chest, one to the skull and jumped. Died days later of hypothermia. IDK if this fits, but when I die I want someone to pour a load of popcorn kernels in me, so the cremation gets pretty surprising at some point. Ask a mortician recently debunked this as the temperature in a furnace is too high for kernels to pop. They would be immediately incinerated. Not an autopsy doctor, but a story I heard from my local sheriff. The local department found a guy that killed himself by shooting himself while on a fire that burned up his body pretty bad. The autopsy doctor found out that he was full of bullets and was hoping for bullets to go off as his body burnt away. Honestly, if write a whole paragraph and then say serious tag, or I made it up, duck you. Honestly, if write a whole paragraph and then say serious tag, or I made it up, duck you. What? Not me, but my friend's dad was, and she used to help him, except this one time. There was a family with 8 or 10 kids, I can't quite remember. They decided to treat their kids to a day at an amusement park, and decided to all squeeze in a van. Well, they got in a car accident. Because they were squeezed into one car they weren't wearing seatbelts. All the kids died. or their bodies were in pieces. The parents elected to identify the pieces to properly bury them. I can't imagine your decision resulting in all of your children dying and then having to identify their mangled remains. So, wear seatbelts, kids. Oh my, you watched until the end? That's fucking awesome, dude. Thanks for watching.